So to begin, well, hello and welcome to everyone joining us today for our Contentious Clinic. This month, we are dealing with the interesting yet very sad topic of elder abuse. Unfortunately, this is something we are finding many more cases of. It's becoming more prevalent in society. There's an aging population. Many are expecting an inheritance as a way of funding their lifestyle or even their own retirement. And so more and more of these issues and cases are going to come up, and certainly that's what we're finding. For those of you not aware, and actually it was Paul that sort of reminded me of this on LinkedIn, that it's actually Elder Abuse Awareness Day tomorrow. It's always held on the 15th of June each year. It's an internationally recognised day brought about by the UN. And while the day itself is there to raise awareness of all forms of elder abuse, today we're going to focus our attention on financial abuse specifically. As I've mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Smith. Paul is a qualified forensic accountant and a former police detective sergeant, so spot on credentials. Using his uniquely acquired skills, he started his own consultancy business, Paul Smith Consultancy, and he uses that experience and expertise to help those who are looking to dispute or have concerns over payments that have been made, most often taken without authority, both pre and post death. Paul acts as an international subject matter expert in all areas of financial crime, but as I say, today we're going to focus predominantly on elder abuse and financial abuse specifically. If you do want any more information about Paul, obviously you can email him direct, but equally he is one of our spotlight persons within our IDRN, so do also have a look there. So the plan for today, just so you've all got a bit of an idea, is for us all to leave the webinar clear on what elder abuse is, what the red flags are that you should be alert to, and what we should do if those red flags come up. The intention, to help keep us all entertained, is to interject any potentially dry subject area with real life case stories and outcomes. And as I've said, finally, if time allows, we'll deal with questions at the end. Please use the chat function. Just as a reminder, for those watching a recorded version of this webinar, don't use the chat function, email me and I'll come back to you instead. And for those of you who are understandably keen on timings, the webinar is expected to last around 30 minutes, so we won't keep you too long, some perfect pre-lunch viewing. Okay, so to begin, Paul, perhaps you would be so kind just to say hi to everyone and take the opportunity to explain what elder abuse is in terms of financial abuse.
Good morning, everyone. Perhaps if I just sort of give a little bit of my background as to how I started to deal with this sort of stuff, you kind of understand where I'm coming from in terms of elder abuse. So I was the first incumbent in the role of Vulnerable Adults Investigations Coordinator for Dorset Police. So in that role, I had to look at how these sorts of issues were being dealt with nationally and internationally by the police and other resources that are available out there. So elder abuse in my book and my company is set up to deal with the interfamilial abuse. So it's abuse basically where there is perhaps a power of attorney or deputyship in place, and the person who's got the role of the deputy or the attorney has helped themselves to money of the subject person. So it covers a sort of a wide range of offending. The cases that I've kind of dealt with historically have been multi-thousand pounds withdrawals of cash and transfer of funds to pay off mortgages, bank loans, that sort of thing.
Sorry, just have to unmute myself there. Yeah. Great summary. Thank you, Paul. So essentially what we're saying is somebody stepped in who shouldn't have, either with power of attorney sort of authority or not, done something they shouldn't have done, and brings them into a situation where something has gone amiss with someone's finances. I think it's a great summary.
Yeah.
I find personally, in terms of claims that come across my desk, so many stem from a mistrust or a misinformation between siblings, such as when one sibling has a power of attorney or tends to bring themselves into a situation where they're the ones that are going to look after the finances. The other one tends to live a bit further afield, and so there is always that immediate, well, hang on, who's doing that and why? But they all tend to have a common theme, I find, and that's the idea that the money one day is going to be theirs. So, what's the problem? Is that something you've had experience of, Paul?
Yes, I mean, certainly as a police officer, one of the last cases I dealt with was a lady who lived in the Dorset area. She was 98 at the time, and her step granddaughter lived in Surrey. And basically, what she was doing, she was became the power of attorney for her gran, and she basically would visit gran sporadically. But each time she would visit, she would withdraw money to sort of compensate herself. So basically, she would charge for charge a gran mileage. She would charge her 50 pence a mile. She would charge to have a car valeted, and all this was kind of as a means to sort of legitimize her spending. So as soon as she got the power of attorney, you could see when you started to look at the bank accounts that the money was just being drawn down at rocket pace. The net result was that she was we put a file to the Crown Prosecution Service. She was convicted, and she got 2 years in prison, I think. Now, the interesting thing was she'd never ever been in trouble. She never had a parking ticket, as far as I'm aware. I was concerned that the jury would side with her because she was going to be the sole beneficiary of the estate, but the jury took just 2 hours to convict unanimously. So although it was going to be hers because she'd helped herself to it early on, and there was another victim in that there was the care home, so there's a big bill that was outstanding. So that's perhaps what swayed the Crown Prosecution Service to take the case.
Yeah, I can definitely see situations, and I've had them arise where they come up post death. That's what we deal with. So post death, and you've got one beneficiary. They're the person that took the money. Yes, there was obviously some issue during that poor person's lifetime. They didn't have the funds available that they otherwise should have had, and they might have had sort of poorer care. But if there's no debts outstanding and it is just their inheritance, it's unfortunate. But really, who's going to spend money pursuing it, and who the police are definitely not going to get involved. Which actually sort of brings me to, I suppose, the fact is that practically it comes down to when the theft's discovered, and the impact it's going to have on that particular person and any involvement then with third parties. As I've said, we deal with it post-death, so the victims unfortunately already passed away. At that stage, it tends to be the children that are disputing the transaction. Mm-hmm. It either crops up alone if they're due to inherit equally, or we find that it's alongside a probate dispute or will validity dispute if conveniently a will has also suddenly been prepared during that same sort of time where there was this vulnerable person involved in that process. But one thing I have found, I think probably many of our listeners, viewers today will have, is that actually it can be quite difficult to get the police involved in these matters, because if you contact them, subject to authority to do so, if you contact them, then they'll turn around and say, well, it's a civil, or it's just a family matter, it's nothing to do with us. We'd obviously all hope they'd be more willing to get involved pre-death, because certainly post-death they're very reluctant. But Paul, given your work history and your involvement in the police, and as you've said to us, it was one of your cases that you dealt with, any tips for those joining us today on how they can get the police to engage?
I find it so frustrating. My former colleagues, and honestly, I kind of blame it on the austerity measures that the police they shrunk, so they've lost some of the skill set. But having said that, when I did my master's degree and my dissertation was around elder financial abuse, and I did a significant amount of research and just saw who was dealing with these types of cases with the police, and it was actually uniform. And if I'm honest, having been in CID most of my sort of police career, they were doing a better job than the CID detectives. However, it's and this is why I love doing these webinars, because I just want to get the word out there that police write these things off as civil, and it's not a civil debt, and they have not got the authority or the knowledge in law to actually make that decision. And I know, because I've been the decision maker making those decisions, and we've convicted people. So I speak with some experience. So getting back to your question, the key thing is never use the word fraud. As soon as you use fraud, it goes into action fraud. They'll refer you to action fraud, goes into that big pot and never comes out the other end. So there will always be a theft. And I always recommend, and I spoke a couple of weeks ago at a webinar and said, look, please don't use the term fraud if you can help it, but theft will do. And I also use this sort of silver platter method, so whereby I present the evidence, as a former detective, the evidence that I present, I know reaches the standards that are looked at for the Crown prosecutors. So, kind of think of the document, the code of practice for Crown prosecutors, where they look at the public interest and the standard of the evidence. So as long as you're kind of safe on those grounds, and perhaps maybe delicately point that out to the police that, in your opinion as a lawyer, it reaches those standards, and just put it the best way you can. That's all I can say. I've tried and failed, but then I've tried and won. It's a luck of the draw, unfortunately, and it's who you get at the other end of the phone.
Do you think with the austerity measures as well, it really will depend on where you live in the country as well? It could be that actually the police force is better able to deal with it due to crime rates or something else. Could that have any sort of impact?
Sadly not, because
No?
some of the cases I've dealt with, we talk about Greater Manchester Police, then I've Devon and Cornwall, Sussex, Surrey. It's anywhere. The Met, as bad as anyone else. It's just that the lack of skills and training to kind of understand these things. And what I would say is that statistically, elder abuse, not necessarily elder financial abuse, is actually more prevalent, possibly not dealt with, more prevalent than, sorry, that's Alexa speaking, more prevalent than actual domestic abuse and child abuse.
Is it?
Joined together. Yeah,
Gosh.
Statistically.
Do you think with that statistic then there will be more training in the police force or anything like that? So we will find it's easier to refer these matters over?
I'd like to think so. And it's been my goal. I set this business up 6 years ago, and it's been my goal to try and get some recognition. Now, the Americans deal with this very well because they have these, what they call forensic centers, whereby the expertise is pooled. So if they have a problem that social care or the police deal with, they can pull on these experts to kind of guide their investigation. And as a consequence, because those clinics exist, it's kind of increased the experience of police and social workers, because social workers are just as bad, really, not picking up the signs and reporting it. And I've found in a lot of cases, and I'm going off track slightly here, in a lot of cases, people assume that someone else is taking the right action, and then nobody has. So my message is really do something, even if you think someone else has done it, because it's better 2 or 3 people make the same complaint, and you got a better chance of then it being picked up and dealt with by the police or whichever authority's got it.
And do you think there's the sort of an ideal world, there'd be some sort of scattergun approach? So you go to the OPG, you would speak to adult social services, you would maybe speak to the GP if they were the link that elderly person had. Would you just go, you know what, I'm going to go to as many people as possible, as long as I've got the requisite authority, I'm going to as many people as possible to get the news out there that this is a problem?
Yes, but ironically, we did all of that. So in a case last year, which was kind of pushed back by a force on the south coast. I won't say which, but it's between Hampshire and Kent. So basically, this force, they refused to accept that this referral that had been made by my client was financial abuse. They said, "No, this is a civil matter, and it's not for the police to deal with." They actually spoke with the suspect, and the suspect said it was a gift. She gifted me the money. But when you then got down in the weeds and you found out that actually the lady wasn't in a position to gift the money, and the money that was gifted, £25,000 in this case, was repayment of a loan for some building work on her home, and her home was actually a council house that she lived in. It didn't take much to join the dots up. What then happened? The £25,000. Let me wind back a little bit. He took the victim to the bank to get a transfer of the £25,000. The bank, being quite switched on, separated the two of them and got different stories. So they said, no, we're not going to do the transfer. So what then happened? He got hold of her debit card and he drew down the £25,000 ATM various ATM machines near his home. And even then, the police just wouldn't accept that it was theft. So we got no traction with the police. We got no, even with the MP being involved, we got no traction. I then recommended that the client speak with the financial ombudsman, because I felt that the bank were at fault in allowing the drawdown of money. 25k takes a lot of ATM transactions to be able to draw down. And we actually won the day, and the bank then paid back the estate, because sadly the victim had died by this point, but actually paid the money back into the estate. So the scattergun approach does work.
Well, that's at least a small shining light that it could possibly work. Yeah. So I suppose before we get too bogged down in what we can do about it, because that's one of the points we're going to cover today, I think if we take a step back, as you say, and look at the red flags. So we know what elder abuse is. We know roughly how to try and get the police involved, and that scattergun approach works fabulously. But what do you think those red flags are in terms of what people on the day-to-day basis, they've got someone maybe to write a will, or someone's got some financial planning they're doing, and they're a bit concerned, or just generally it's your aunt, your uncle, your gran, you're concerned. What should you be looking out for?
Well, I mean, that last case with the drawdown of £25,000, I mean, that's a pretty obvious one. You see all these transactions. It's when there's an additional person been added as a signatory, unusual transfers. I mean, these are fairly obvious, but when you sort of look at a pattern, and then you've suggested earlier on that someone might have been gifted £1,000 for a birthday. Well, if there's no history of that, then obviously that's another red flag. I dealt with a case which elderly parents in 2 different care homes, daughter, the sole beneficiary, was a resident in the States. And what had happened, she'd got management of her mum's Lloyd's account and informed the bank that mum had moved with her to the States. Well, she hadn't, but the bank hadn't picked up where the transactions were taking place, and it was all a bit of a mess. And although CPS initially were happy to sort of support an investigation, when it actually came to the crunch of potential extradition, they kind of went back on their word. So we had to walk away from that one. But it's kind of, to me, it's sort of fairly obvious. But and when I kind of do my analysis of the banking, the first thing I look at is the ATM withdrawals and any transactions that just don't look right. And often the flag for me as a police coordinator when working with social services is when the power of attorney went sort of cap in hand to the local authority for funding when they hit that magic figure of £23,250. And always, if there was an issue, it was when they went, if they would have kept quiet and not gone to the local authority, they'd never got caught. And the woman from Surrey that I spoke of, that's how she kind of got caught, because she asked for funding when funds got down below the threshold figures. So those are the sorts of things I kind of look for. Just look at the amounts, the drawdown of money, ATM withdrawals are the biggie, but any unusual transactions and self-funding. If an LPA is then transferring funds themselves, that's obviously a fairly big red flag.
I think from a human point of view, you can see why some people feel they're trying to help mum or dad by moving assets out, because then they're getting sort of that government funding. It's a bit of a twisted view, because actually what they're doing is helping out their own later inheritance, aren't they? The argument being, well, mum and dad would never have wanted to lose all their money on this, and now it's
and it's deemed, of course, a self-deprivation of assets. So that's the first thing that the local authority will look at.
And I'm sure many people with us today and viewing this at a later date will be there going, this is why key financial planning early is exactly what's important. You need to do it. Yeah. So, it just reinforces that, doesn't it?
Okay. I mean, taking it back, the advice from perhaps a solid accredited financial advisor, Society of Later Life Advisors advisor, investing in retirement bonds and that sort of thing. That's one thing. But it's when you do that, when the person is diagnosed with dementia and they're just about to go in a care home, no, that's not going to work.
Yeah, you're definitely going to get in trouble for deprivation of assets there, aren't you? Yeah. Nobody's going to let that fly. No, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so as I say, we've run through what elder abuse is, which is fabulous. Tick number one off. We have gone through how to get the police involved in difficult circumstances. It's not always possible, but we can do. We've got some better tips and tricks to do that. We know scattergun approach is the best in circumstances where we can't get the right people involved, and we know what red flags to look out for. So I suppose now the bit that everyone probably wants to know is the all-important question of actually, well, this situation's arisen, these red flags are here, I have some concerns. What can or should I be doing about it?
Well, the first thing, it depends on the person's capacity, is, a referral to local authority, safeguarding alert. And then hopefully if the system works properly, the local authority will then kind of reach out to the police will do their own research, and they will look at things like to see whether suspicious activity reports have been submitted by the bank, and just kind of start to get an intelligence picture. This is how it should work. I'm not promising that that's how it now works, but this is how it used to work, and this is how it should work. And then, there can be a sort of a joint approach with police and social services. But again, it's very much dependent on the mental capacity of the individual. If they have got capacity and they don't want the police involved, well, then the police have to step back. But if there's a significant risk of harm to the individual, then the police can support the local authority to try and safeguard that individual, and will do, even if it's the local neighbourhood police officer visiting on the odd occasions, just to keep check and send a sort of a signal to the would-be abuser that the police are monitoring the situation.
Yeah, about prevention, hopefully, to prevent anything further happening.
Yes, sure.
It sounds very much like it's circumstantially based, which makes perfect sense to all of us probably listening today, is that actually, depending on the circumstances, depends on what you've got to do. From my point of view, as I said earlier, it's only post-death, and we are all about the evidence. And it's what evidence can we get? Like you say, look for the red flags. We would be looking for them after the event. So we'd be looking, like you say, through the bank statements and going, gosh, this is a lot of cash transactions, or a lot of buying stuff online when this person has never been online before. You would talk to family members where these online transfers as well, if the person doesn't have an online account. There's lots of things you can look at in terms of the bank statements and the financial tracing. How do you help people with that then, Paul?
What I tend to do, and probably a good example is a case I dealt with last year for a lawyer, and basically I asked the lawyer to request the care records. Now, this elderly lady went into a care home. She was in her late 80s, I guess, and her physical health really declined rapidly. But as her physical health declined, and she had fluctuating capacities, she had type 1 diabetes, but didn't really medicate herself particularly well with it, and there were issues. What I then asked for is obviously the bank accounts to analyse, and then I kind of looked at that in conjunction with the health records, and then I got sort of combined the two and got a combined timeline. And that timeline allowed me to sort of speak with some sort of confidence about the lady's physical state at the time that certain transactions took place. In this particular case, the daughter and the granddaughter were powers of attorney. Daughter sadly died, and her daughter, so the granddaughter of the subject, became the power of attorney. Daughter paid for her mother's funeral from the account, which, okay, it's possibly what might have been wanted, but there was no evidence to suggest that she had the authority to do that. And what I did is then looked at the spending and the type of spending. So there was a lot of purchases made for online shops, which just didn't sort of sit with her sort of age, and someone who's kind of in a hospital or a care home bed, who just didn't have the need for the sort of type of clothing that was purchased. So I kind of just I identified those transactions and suggested that perhaps I couldn't say this money's been stolen, but what I could say is here's this lady who's bedbound, who's buying these designer dresses and what have you. Over to you.
It adds a level of suspicion, doesn't it? It goes, look here, this is a list of transactions with some actual human content added in that says this happened at this time. Is that likely? ?
Yeah. And that's kind of the best you can do, really, is just, make that sort of presentation.
And if the person is still alive, which is when they're, to be fair, probably most impacted, they're losing their money, they're potentially losing better care home and all the rest of it. If they're still alive, that's when you want to be really getting involved, adult social services, you want to be getting involved with the OPG. If this is someone that's an attorney, you want to think about whether or not it's appropriate to say, actually, they're not suitable power of attorney, we need to get them removed. Those sort of things are the sort of thing you need to be thinking about. And if you've got a wayward child that's not even a power of attorney, that's just got access to mum or dad's bank accounts, talk to the bank, get them to be aware that these transactions are taking place, get authorities, shut things down. The one thing that everyone, I'm sure, will be thinking about is, well, hang on, nobody's saying I can do this. What are my powers? Are we allowed to be getting involved? Do you have any thoughts or comments you want to make in terms of whether that's something that they can do?
Well, it's a difficult one for family members that kind of see this stuff going on. And that's where you kind of have to be a little bit reliant on social care and the police, really, who have got that authority at the end of the day, So, but again, it's all very much dependent on the mental capacity of the individual. That's kind of that's often the stumbling block. But there are ways around these things, and as a police officer, I've perhaps gone a little bit further than I maybe should have done on occasion, whereby, I had an elderly gent. Take it back a step. This woman was convicted of kiting checks. So basically, she was a carer for this lady, and she was pulling checks out of the back of a checkbook and signing them and cashing them. She was convicted. She had a teenage son who had sort of mental health problems. So a probation officer was assigned and decided that perhaps a prison sentence wasn't appropriate. So they gave her a community sentence. And the community sentence was for her to work in a day centre for the elderly, which is kind of like putting a child abuser in a kindergarten. But there we go. The very first day that she started her community sentence, she recruited her next victim, was this elderly gent in his late 70s. He fell in love with her. And what she was doing, she was kind of staying late into the evening and dipping his wallet late at night, going to the ATM machine, and then was back early in the morning, put the wallet back. And, we kind of understood what was going on. But because he was in love with her and he had the capacity, there wasn't a great deal we could do. What we did do, this is probably something we shouldn't have done, but we gave him the press cutting of the conviction of this woman with this elderly lady. So he's kind of aware of what was going on. The end result was we couldn't actually get him to take action, but he died, sadly, 6 months later, whatever it was. And when he died, we found out that in his will, he'd left all his money to charity, which was because they'd actually got married as well. I missed that, but they got married at some point between. But so she didn't get all the money, but she got a large chunk of it. So some of these you just can't, you've got to walk away from.
Yeah, that does. It touches briefly on predatory marriage, which we're not going to deal with today because that's an entire topic on its own, which obviously marriage automatically at the minute revokes a will, which causes no end of problems because the capacity at the minute deemed to say, yes, I can get married versus writing a will are very different. The Law Commission are currently reviewing all of that, so that I'm sure there'll be something new happening in that. I hope there'll be something new happening in that in the future that protects those certain individuals. But in terms of where we're at and what we can do in elder abuse, particularly with regard to finances, it seems to be keep an eye out for, know what it is, keep an eye out for the red flags, involve all of the relevant agencies that you can, provided you've got suitable authority to do so, and gather evidence. Any bit of evidence you can get, or you can create reports that do the human interest side versus the actual transactions, which can add huge insight. The one thing I would add on that is if you are listening and you're going to be gathering together documents and information, gather the GP reports. Also, you can't just make one application to the GP and say, give us all the reports. You have to then make separate applications to all the hospitals and all the care homes. Everything is separate authorities for all of it. So you need to do a broad, it's everyone, not just one, and hope for the best. And if you find during the lifetime you can't do anything and you're really struggling, just the best advice I can give is keep detailed information, keep evidence, figure out what's going on as best you can, keep those notes. And if in a sad day comes in the future that something untoward has happened, a will change when someone didn't really have capacity, or it turns out that they've then died and you can see huge tranches of money have gone, then there are things that we can look to do to try and deal with those issues post-death, albeit it's not now for the benefit of the person that was the victim in the whole thing.
Yeah. Can I just give a very quick plug to powers of attorney? Now, one might think that I'm very much against them, but and I had an interesting conversation with Denzel Lush, who was at that time the senior judge at the Court of Protection. He was very much against powers of attorney, and he gave me his reasons why. And although his daughter was a lawyer who'd make an ideal attorney, he wanted her to wait until he'd lost capacity to take deputyship as the better course of action. However, we now have a power of attorney bond, and they're not that expensive, and it covers the attorney in case there's any financial mismanagement. But the advice that I would give is, if you're going to have a power of attorney, is perhaps to consider a professional, a lawyer, to sit alongside a family member, and then it's kind of belt and braces and everybody's kind of protected. Okay, there's another element of expense there, but to safeguard everybody. And what Denzel was doing, he was safeguarding his daughter, against any sort of accusations by other family members. So yeah.
I was going to say that you do risk running into having a power of attorney being joint and severable, means that even if you have a professional involved, they're not necessarily directly active. I can see why Denzel Lush was very much deputyship seems good. It's got the bond, they can't do anything. It's a court appointed person. And that's what happens if you've got an attorney that's been a bit naughty and there isn't a replacement attorney in place. It has to go through deputyship. So you can always see both sides of the coin. And again, it's something it's just not perfect at the minute. And I'm sure everyone here today will have their own views on which is better or why there's these downfalls and what's great about them as well. Because powers of attorney give you the chance to choose, and to choose when they're active, not just because I've now too far, I've lost capacity. And obviously there is a delay. If you've got to wait for deputyship, chances are that person's already lost capacity before they're then down the line. It's 3 months, potentially even more, before the Court of Protection have been able to deal with it. So absolutely, there are definite pros for power of attorney, but there are also cons, as there is with everything.
Yeah, and you can go wrong with deputyship as well, of course. But
exactly. The one thing I've just looked at the clock, so I'm ever so sorry, everyone. I am very conscious of the fact that we have run over time. I would hope to say that we have truly delivered on what we promised and covered all the topics that are relevant to elder abuse. All I can say then is this has been another great Contentious clinic. Thank you again to Paul, who's the first person we've invited on one of these as a guest speaker. As I said at the beginning, the recording will be uploaded to the IDRN later today and emailed out to everyone who registered. So please do share it with your colleagues and use it as you wish for a recap on the points covered. Our next Contentious clinic will take place on Wednesday, the 19th of July, 2023. We surveyed our members on their preferred CPD topics, and there were 3 clear leaders, and in no particular order. They were Lark v. Nugas requests, preventative measures, and the Inheritance Provision Family Dependence Act, otherwise known as the 1975 Act. Over half of those surveyed wanted more training on the 1975 Act, so that's what we're going to cover in July. My colleague and fellow partner, Eleanor Stenson, will be running that clinic. She's going to cover off all the types of claims that can be made, as well as the pitfalls and benefits of making such a claim, so definitely not one to miss. So thank you to everyone there for joining us today, and particularly to Paul, as I've said, who has done a fabulous job of keeping us not only informed, but entertained as well with his numerous stories. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Contentious clinic.